We're driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Leveraging over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Just go to Indeed.com/Blue Wire right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed.
Holmgren had coached a lot of these players previously, and so you certainly saw it there. Watching the game back this week on YouTube, it was really interesting to see sort of how bottled up Steve Young was. In this game, he threw for 328 yards, but it took him 65 attempts, and he threw 2 interceptions. So, good on Fritz Shurmur and the Packers staff to really slow down what was one of the premier offenses in the NFL at the time.
It's January 96, Packers at Niners. This is Remember That Game, the podcast about sporting events that take you on a journey and maybe chart the path of the zeitgeist. I'm your host, Thomas Emerick, and my guest is Eric Eager, Vice President at SumerSports and co-host of the SumerSports Show. We recorded this episode in January of 2020, back when he was at PFF. Enjoy the show. With what clarity do you remember where you were when the Packers scored the upset as 9.5-point dogs?
Pretty clear. 1995 was the first year that I watched football live, and I grew up a Vikings fan, but I also grew up hating the Packers. I grew up, and that was the season where the 49ers were coming off of a Super Bowl title, and they kind of limped their way to the 2 seed. But I think we all thought that they would win this game. They were 9.5-point favorites coming in. They had this game had a 52-point over-under. People expected a lot of scoring, and unfortunately it took the Niners all the way until the end of the first half to even get their first points.
So as a Vikings fan growing up, given the Packers were division rivals but hadn't made any sort of run since the 60s, on the other hand, the Niners, not a division rival, but made you eat shit for the past 7 years. How complicated were your rooting interests that day?
Oh, I rooted for the Niners. I really liked Steve Young. I liked the dual threat that he represented. I was too young to watch Montana live, and so Steve Young was really the first West Coast quarterback that I got to watch. So I really wanted him to play well, and then of course Jerry Rice, who I ended up growing up and being a high school and college wide receiver, and so Jerry Rice is the first one I looked up to, and so I always rooted for San Francisco.
It was more late 80s when the Niners knocked the Vikings out of the playoffs a couple years in a row after the Vikings knocked the Niners out. You had this weird, interesting interconnection of matchups where the Niners owned the Vikings, who were put out a lot of playoff teams. The Packers seemed to own the Niners from that day going forward. The Cowboys and Niners went back and forth. Would you venture to guess that in the 90s, the game of schematic and personnel matchups were maybe a larger part of the equation in who wins and loses?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because you talk about, Holmgren was the head coach of the Niners. He was the offensive coordinator with George Seifert once, I believe it was from 1990 on forward, but prior to that, he was the quarterback coach. And then Dennis Green was, of course, also on Walsh's staff. So this was all these sort of interconnected things. And I think there was a little bit to the fact that the Packers had the Niners number because Holmgren had coached a lot of these players previously, and so you certainly saw it there. Watching the game back this week on YouTube, it was really interesting to see sort of how bottled up Steve Young was. In this game, he threw for 328 yards, but it took him 65 attempts, and he threw 2 interceptions. So, good on Fritz Shurmur and the Packers staff to really slow down what was one of the premier offenses in the NFL at the time.
Fritz Shermer had coached the Rams defense for much of the 80s. Got to see a lot of that Walsh offense, even though now it's under Seifert and Trestman that year, but still a lot of same concepts. When I saw Steve run down 21-0, run for like a 47-yard run near the end of the half, and he had another play where he like ran straight toward the end zone and got creamed, I thought about something you said about Josh Allen, which is he runs like Mo Schrute. And
Yes.
the Packers had Young running like Mo Schrute that day, which showed they were pretty desperate.
Yeah, you look at this game, the Niners had, kind of a respectable 87 yards rushing, but only 5. So Derek Lavelle was the running back that took over for Ricky Waters, who left for the Eagles that year. Their starting running back in the game had 8 carries for 5 yards, and so most of the ground game was Steve Young on scrambles, and he had that 141-yard run. But mostly they contained him. And really it was, the fact is like the Niners really, that was one of their Achilles heel back then, was after Waters left, they really didn't have a running back that could make the plays out of the backfield. Lavelle was a decent receiver, but not of Waters' caliber. And Adam Walker was the guy who caught the ball that got fumbled for the first touchdown by Craig Newsome. So that was sort of a place where you saw the Niners a season ago, 94, brilliant in basically every part of offensive play, being a little bit more one-dimensional in 95.
And then on the other side of the ball, they try to run 23 times with Edgar Bennett, only 51 yards going up against Stubblefield and Bryant there. Brett Favre basically carrying the day. I think at one point in the game, he was like 13 for 14 or something like that for like 200 yards.
Absolutely. And he always brought out his best against the Niners, 96 playoffs, 97 playoffs, even the 98 playoff game. He had the Niners on the ropes, and it took a Terrell Owens touchdown to break the streak in the last minute. But yeah, Favre, it was always so interesting, right? Because there were games where you couldn't win with him. He threw too many interceptions, but there were some games where he showed you why he would eventually become a Hall of Famer. He completed, I think that's 70% of his passes, 75% of his passes, over 10 yards an attempt, no interceptions. Really overcame the fact that, they didn't have much on the ground. They were a very fun and deep team. This was the year after Sterling Sharp had to retire with his neck injury. So Robert Brooks had 4 catches for over 100 yards. Heath Jackson was a tight end they picked up mid-season. He had 4 catches for over 100 yards. And Mark Chmura brought in a touchdown. So they were a very deep offense, good offensive line. And of course, obviously, Brett Favre, the future Hall of Famer.
One of my favorite coach-player relationships in history was Holmgren and Favre. It felt like a very father-son relationship, where the father is constantly nervous with what his son's doing and very open about it. In the pregame, someone actually interviewed Holmgren on the sideline and, as usually, said, "Hey, we just got to make sure we don't turn the ball over," which is speaking directly to Favre.
Yeah, absolutely. And they were only a year away. Favre was the MVP in '95, but they were, the prior season, there were the significant thoughts that Holmgren was going to actually bench Favre in place of Mark Brunell, who had actually went on and had a pretty good career himself. Brunell got drafted in the expansion draft by the Jaguars the following year. But Favre, he grew up a lot over the 95 season, and it showed quite a bit in this game. And to your point, the coach relationship with Holmgren Favre was one of the best probably we'll ever see.
It seemed like, especially early on, and even at some point in the second half when they did throw, they were really attacking Pete Carroll's adaptation on Seifert's defense with the tight ends, hitting them in the seam, and then getting Chmura on that corner route. Do you feel like that kind of traces a little bit to how you attack Carroll's defenses today?
Oh, that's a good question. Oh, that's interesting. I have seen, historically the Seattle Seahawks have struggled with wheel routes to the tight ends off play action, so that could certainly have carried. I know the Niners, when they lost Deion Sanders that season from 94 to 95, they replaced him with Marquez Pope. But mostly their secondary, I believe 3 of the 4 members of that secondary made the Pro Bowl that year in Merton Hanks, Tim McDonald, and Eric Davis. So it was sort of the linebackers a little bit in coverage that were the weaker spot of otherwise what was a great defense, and good on Holmgren for exploiting it.
Carroll defenses, they rely on the linebackers and pattern matching a lot, and if the linebackers come through, the defense looks great, but it's a lot of stress, and Packers got him in that play action. That Pete Carroll, offensive coordinator that day, he owes the most to one mentor from his time both at the University of Arkansas and the Minnesota Vikings in the 80s when they knocked off the Niners. Do you know that mentor?
Monte Kiffin.
Yep.
Terrific defensive coordinator eventually, but yeah, he and with Minnesota as well. So yeah, fun to sort of rehash that.
So this starts a new segment I haven't tried before. Still workshopping the name, but it's a segment called That's Incestuous. And it's about all the various coaching trees and the machinations and how that kind of shaped the matchups and who owned who in the 90s when the same teams kept bumping into each other in the playoffs. So Eagles coach that weekend was also on the slate. He was going to go against the Cowboys in the Sunday early game.
Ray Rhodes.
Coordinator for both the Packers and Niners.
Yep.
And his first offensive coordinator was this other Packers assistant who had been around in the early 90s for Ray Rhodes.
Gruden.
Yep. The Packers tight end coach that day against the Niners were Keith Jackson, Mark Shimura tore up the Niners. That really keyed the offense along with Robert Brooks. Tight ends showed out that day. Their tight end coach would go on to be a head coach and eventually hire the nephew of that day's Packers defensive coordinator, Fritz Shurmur.
Andy Reid.
Yep. So Fritz Shurmur, defensive coordinator that day, came up with the West Coast beater for that time. It also developed a big nickel when he was with Arizona in the early 90s, and was able to, a lot in the second half, just rush three guys, place them underneath zone, and then get other guys in man. Fritz Shurmur with a masterpiece day that kind of goes underrated, I feel like. This Niners defensive coordinator that day would eventually groom a man who would later become a Niners defensive coordinator.
Oh, so Pete Carroll, Robert Salah.
Yep. This weekend in January 96, you could get brutalized by the teaser potentially. Some pretty wild things happening. The NFC, no one loses at home in the divisional round at that time. If you try to tease the Niners down from the 9.5, you lose. On the other side of the bracket, you have the Chiefs as favorites at home as the number 1 seed against the Colts. The Chiefs going in as 8-point favorites. You try to tease that down. Well, they lost at home to the Colts.
Chiefs didn't even score 8 points in the game, right? So,
yeah. Something that tracks from 96 to now is that, the Chiefs, we're the 1 seed at home, but 25th in passing offense that year. First in defense, but 25th in passing offense. They lose their first game at home in the playoffs. And then, Steelers blow out the Bills. They I guess was a close game. They knock out Jim Kelly. You're basically in a better position that weekend if you just take the Steelers, lay a bunch of points. You take the Cowboys, they blow out the Eagles, lay a bunch of points. But you try to tease down the Niners and the Chiefs, and you have two highly seeded teams at home getting upset.
And that's the tricky part about it. As you said, what tracks back to this year is Kansas City won with defense, and I think the Chiefs in 95 won, I believe, 3 or 4 of their games in overtime, and they had like 3 or 4 punt return touchdowns and a lot of defensive touchdowns. And of course, that's so unstable that in the playoffs, a team with a slightly better offense in Indianapolis and Jim Harbaugh went in to Kansas City, and Kansas City's kicker missed, I believe, 3 field goals in that game too. So just kind of a string of bad luck for Kansas City.
I don't think that Kansas City had a receiver anywhere close top 50 or 60 in receiving yards. The Chiefs did have the modern day Austin Eckler, or the proto Austin Eckler, I should say, in Kimball Landers.
That's right. Yeah, he was a very good player. Those Chiefs, interestingly, I believe, were plus over 100 in turnover differential for the decade. Really hard to sustain that, but somehow the Chiefs did it under Marty Schottenheimer and eventually the late Gunther Cunningham.
Steve Bono, he had a backup quarterback who came in to throw some passes that day. This backup quarterback also came in the late 80s when the Niners were routing the Vikings in the playoffs. Do you know who that backup?
Future future NFL MVP Rich Gannon.
Yeah, eventually he found that West Coast offense with Gruden. But in the early 90s, a guy who just as likely to throw more interceptions as touchdowns, would he be the proto Ryan Fitzpatrick up until that point?
Yeah, I'd have to say that. And I think Ryan Fitzpatrick and Jameis would fit in so much better in the 95s than they would have in nowadays. Where interceptions are a little bit more acceptable back then. They're not so much right now.
Again, was on some teams where he would come in, play well, and then, just suddenly get benched on the Vikings, or he'd get suddenly benched on Washington, come in, he'd be 5-1 with the Chiefs, and then finding himself benched over and over again. Eventually finds his John Gruden. Is there any hope Ryan Fitzpatrick finds his John Gruden?
I think it's probably the end for him, but at the same time, you can make the argument that somebody like Winston would be, kind of more of a Gannon.
Right.
But yeah, the hard part is the way that the rules are structured now. Teams don't have the incentive to carry a third quarterback. So Gannon was the Vikings' third quarterback behind Wade Wilson and Tommy Kramer for like 3-4 years. Never got on the field. Finally got a chance. Like by now, there aren't that many quarterbacks who sit on the bench for 4 years. You're either a top pick who gets a chance to play right away, or you're kind of a practice squad guy that gets shuffled around a bunch and you don't really see them. There are obviously clear exceptions, but it's just tougher now for guys like Gannon to make way because they're not being stashed as the third quarterback on a team anymore.
We're driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Leveraging over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Just go to Indeed.com/Blue Wire right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed.
But yeah, DraftKings was around, again, it would be like a 4K quarterback today as a backup. You have a slate with Buffalo at Pittsburgh, Green Bay at San Francisco, Philly at Dallas, Colts at Chiefs. I imagine you just stack Packers-Niners and then keep away from the rest, or maybe sprinkle some on Dallas a bit, but interesting weekend.
Philly had just come off of scoring, I believe, 57 points on the Lions the previous week.
With Rodney Peete.
In the game where Lomas Brown guaranteed a victory for the Detroit. So maybe some people were a little bit high on the Lions going into that day, the Eagles going into that day. But ultimately Rodney Peete got injured after 5 plays, and Randall Cunningham came in, I believe, just literally off right out of the hospital with his wife had a baby or something like that. Wow. And he did not. He struggled to acclimate to the John Gruden offense. Let's just say.
It's interesting. You have him coming in for that John Gruden offense, and then he ends up coming in with the Vikings a few years later, taking over for more of a West Coast quarterback in Brad Johnson. And then Dennis Green's a Walsh guy, but it seems like the Vikings offense would end up being transformed by Randall Cunningham.
Yeah, they were very much more a vertical passing game, power running team under Green. He was less of a West Coast guy. In fact, when he started out with Minnesota, he merged the Washington, the Joe Gibbs. His first offensive coordinator was straight from Washington, was Jack Burns, and then he got replaced by Brian Billick. And those guys were sort of more of a vertical passing game, power running game team with a good offensive line. So interestingly, he did not bring the West Coast offense with him.
Some teams fared well against that West Coast, like the Cowboys, Jimmy Johnson Cowboys, and then all the assistants he brought. University of Miami to Dallas. Some stuck around after Jimmy left. A succession of Dave Wanstead and then Butch Davis taking over and Dave Campo. All with Jimmy Johnson at Miami, all with these Cowboy squads from the early to mid-'90s, outside of that one conference championship against San Francisco, kind of owning the Niners, kind of owning Holmgren and the Packers too. I think there's anything to just the Cowboys kind of having the number of that type of offense?
I think it was just a really talent issue, right? Like when you look at They had all the Minnesota Vikings first-round picks for all those years. Russell Maryland was one of them. Obviously, Leon Lett. They had Tony Tolbert. Dixon Edwards, Robert Jones, Darren Smith. They got Deion Sanders. Larry Brown was an 8th round guy back when that existed, and he turned out to be a player. Jaron Woodson was a Vikings draft pick that they ended up getting. So I think they were just far more talented as a team. I think the Troy Aikman in later interviews said that they got worse. They got more poorly coached every single season, but even they won a Super Bowl with Barry Switzer, just because they were more talented than everybody. And this was a classic example, 95, their last Super Bowl.
Anytime I watch anything about the mid-'90s Cowboys and hear Troy Aikman talk about Barry Switzer, it ranges from passive-aggressive to very aggressive.
Yes, it was. Unfortunately, I think that the Cowboys could have accomplished a lot more if Jimmy and Jerry could have gotten along, but that's sort of how it goes, I guess.
Yeah, Jimmy, Jerry, and Barry, what do they have in common from before they were together at Dallas?
Arkansas.
Yep, teammates at Arkansas.
They all played for Arkansas, yeah.
Jerry hiring people that feel like a brother and having difficulty firing someone who feels like a son. Right.
Well, and interestingly, with Garrett interviewing for the OC job for the New York Giants, he was he also went to the Giants as well. So he might end up with two teams that view him as a former player and, as you said, a son.
It seemed like Holmgren, some coaches like Belichick, struggle against former assistants. Flores, now Vrabel. Holmgren would eat his Cubs. Niners upset in January 96. They'd go on to beat them 2 more years in a row and then nearly win on them again, save for the catch. Do you think the 90s Cowboys may be more like Belichickian in that regard of struggling with their former assistants? Wanstead goes 2-1. Yeah, that's a small sample. 2-1 against the Cowboys. Norv Turner had a stretch in the mid-'90s where he went to the Cowboys. Mm-hmm. Is it like one of those things where it's a very good team and how you beat them is maybe something to having a former assistant?
Yeah, there could be certainly something to that. Ultimately it's mostly how the players perform on the field, but yet it's certainly something that you could think about. I know with the Belichickian tree, for example, there are just a lot of things that only Belichick teaches his guys to do, and so if they could turn that back on him, it's probably pretty valuable.
So Packers owned the Niners in that stretch in the mid to late 90s. They ended up beating the Niners again in a wild card in the early 2000s. I think Mariucci, the catch-2 was his only win against the Packers and had a number of losses, including another playoff loss with Garcia. In the last decade, that kind of flipped. McCarthy and Rodgers going against Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh.
I would say starting in 2012, things just got a little bit stale with McCarthy, and we were having all this conversation because McCarthy's a new head coach again. But the way that they drew up their defense in 2012 to try to stop Colin Kaepernick was simply just not good enough. And unfortunately, he kept Capers for another 3-4 years. But they had sort of Eric Walden trying to play one-on-one with Colin Kaepernick in space, and that just had a repeatable and predictable outcome. In 2013, I'm trying to think of, in 2013, it was very much the same thing where, Kaepernick getting out of the pocket really hurt the Green Bay Packers. Now, the Packers also had a home game at 8-7-1. I think the Niners that year were at least 11-5, so, or 13-3 or something like that. So it was just the Niners were simply a better team, and I think that carried further on. Even though, interestingly, McCarthy was a 49ers assistant prior to Harbaugh, and then and weirdly had the worst offense in the NFL the year before he became the Packers coach.
Yeah, that's one of those interesting head coaching moves where it works out, but at the time everyone says, well, he was with an offense that performed badly last year. Are you more skeptical or less skeptical when it comes to how good the offense was for the coach that is now getting a promotion?
I think calling plays is a different skill set than being the head coach if you're going to be a normal head coach that doesn't call plays. So part of me thinks that, you can get by with it, but there's also certainly an issue with the guy. I want the guy to have been successful in a number of places. Now, McCarthy was successful with Aaron Brooks in New Orleans prior, and so maybe it could have just been a one-year blip. Oftentimes, these coaches are sought after for a long time, and they're only they're only acquired after a bad season because that's when they're available. That's how Brad Childress was for Philadelphia. So, I obviously want the guy to be a good coach, but I don't necessarily know if his immediate previous season as a play caller is all that indicative of it.
A couple questions harkening back to the game and then January 96 with the segue that weekend Mike McCarthy was involved as quarterbacks coach for the Chiefs, who went 25th in passing offense. Obviously, he'd have much more success with Aaron Rodgers than Bono. But in that game, the Niners down 21-3. Steve Young, QB sneaks from the 1. Would you guess that this was minus EV? Down multiple touchdowns in the first half. The Niners were continuing to punt. Was there any point in watching that first half where you're like, they had like one of today's analytics teams on that staff, maybe they're going for it as eventually the Packers score again and make it 21-0?
Yeah, so for example, in the second quarter, I believe they had a 4th and 1 from their own 45 when they were down 21-0. I don't think there's any way that a team doesn't go for it today, no matter how blunt that team is. They had a 4th and 3 from Green Bay's 3. They kicked the field goal to go down 18. I think both of those decisions would probably be widely criticized if that were the case now.
This has been another episode of Remember That Game. Please rate, review, subscribe, and check out more episodes.
Shopify helps you sell at every stage of your business. Like that, let's put it online and see what happens stage.
And the site is live.
That we opened a store and need a fast checkout stage.
Thanks. You're all set.
That count it up and ship it around the globe stage.
This one's going to Thailand.
And that, wait, did we just hit 1 million orders stage? Whatever your stage, businesses that grow with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 a month trial at shopify.com/listen.